Welcome back. Last time, we saw the invention of the 365-day calendar. This, I think, was probably Egypt's greatest gift to the world. The Romans didn't have a 365-day calendar and had to continually revise their calendar to be in sync with the natural seasons. When Caesar was sent to Egypt by Rome, he was captivated by Cleopatra, but also by Egypt. Here was a civilization that for thousands of years had been building palaces of stone, writing volumes of literature. Their calendar was far more advanced, and Caesar quickly saw its advantage. Cleopatra introduced Caesar to her astronomer, Sosigenes, who helped Rome revise its calendar. Today, the entire world uses the Egyptian calendar. For homework, I asked you to write 2 sentences involving dates. Let's see how you did. The first was year 8, 3rd month of summer, 3rd day of His Majesty, Tutankhamun. Start with the word for year. This is the way we write years for dates. Remember, it's different for year in the abstract. For that, we'd have a stroke after the loaf T. Now, our date was year 8. So we add 8 strokes. So that's year 8. Next, we need the month sign. And then we add 3 strokes for the 3rd month. Next, we need the season of summer, Shamu. Then, we just need day 3, which is the solar disk with 3 strokes. For His Majesty, the Fuller's Club is often used. The Fuller's Club is the HM biliteral. The club was used by washermen in their work, probably beating clothes on rocks. The club is the word for majesty. And if you want to say His Majesty, you just add the viper suffix pronoun. In dates, it's common to see the Fuller's Club with a water sign N. So if we write it this way, we're not really saying His Majesty. We don't have the viper His. Here, the N means of. So it would be the majesty of. The entire translation would be year 8, 3rd month of summer, 3rd day of the majesty of Tutankhamun. So now we add the Sedge and the B, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, that precedes the Tutankhamun name. Then we insert Tutankhamun, and that's our sentence. Good. Let's do our second sentence. Year 36, 2nd month of inundation, day 4 of His Majesty, Ramses. Again, we start with the word for year. And then we just add 3 hoops and 6 strokes for 36. Now the crescent moon for month. And then we just add 2 strokes for 2nd month. Now we have to remember the word for the season of inundation. It was achet. The word shows the fields that were underwater, and we have the 2 phonetic complement hieroglyphs under the fields. Now we have to do the day. So we add the solar disk and 4 strokes. Another sign that you've seen in dates is the face hieroglyph, where it means under, in the sense of under the reign of His Majesty. So let's add that to our sentence for practice. Next comes the majesty part. Remember, we can do either the club, followed by a stroke and the water sign, which is the majesty of, or we could use the Fuller's Club and the viper, which would be His Majesty. Let's do the first. Next, we add the sedge plant and the bee, since we have the cartouche coming up, and then the name. That's the abbreviated form of Ramses II's name. So that's our sentence. Year 36, 2nd month of inundation, day 4, under the majesty of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ramses. Good. Dates containing the names of the pharaohs are crucial to our being able to reconstruct Egyptian history. But the Egyptians believed there was a time before time. And I don't just mean before the calendar was invented. There was something called primordial time, the time in which the gods came into existence. So I can't tell you the dates of the gods' reigns or when they were born, but I can tell you their names. Knowing the names of the gods is important. Being able to read the names of the main gods will really increase our enjoyment of Egyptian monuments and art. Let's start with some mythology, so we'll know the main gods and why they're important. Perhaps the most frequently encountered gods are Isis and Osiris, and I've mentioned them several times in earlier lectures. Let's begin with their ancestors. There were several competing myths of creation in ancient Egyptian times. We already discussed the version in which Ptah created the world by first thinking it and then saying it on his tongue. Priests of Ptah were happy to propagate this myth. But if you weren't a follower of Ptah, you had an alternative that was even more popular. According to this version, in the beginning were the primordial waters, and in the waters were 4 pairs of primordial gods. The first were Nun and Nunet. Nun is the word for water, so this pair is the water itself. Since feminine words end in T, we know that Nunet is the female in the pair. Along with these two were Hok and Hoket, formlessness. Again, we know that Hoket is the female. And then there was Amun and Amunet, hiddenness. Finally, there was Kok and Koket, darkness. Notice that the traits associated with the 8 gods of the primordial waters, darkness, hiddenness, formlessness, not very positive. The beginning was scary and chaotic. But wait, there's hope. Out of the primordial waters arises the primordial hill. And standing on that hill is Atum, the self-created one. He is the first terrestrial god. Here's his name. The new hieroglyph, the one we haven't seen before, is a sledge on which blocks of stone could have been pulled during construction. If you look closely at it, you can see the metal ring to which ropes were attached for the hauling. This hieroglyph is the TM biliteral, and we should add it to our biliteral list. The primordial hill on which Atum appeared is central to Egyptian religion. The priests of the various temples each claimed that their temple was built on the spot where the primordial hill emerged from the waters of chaos. Now comes the important part. Atum creates more pairs of gods. We have Geb and Nut. Geb is earth and Nut is sky. These are basic elements of the world. Nut is often shown in temples and tombs with her body stretched across the ceiling and her arms down one wall, legs coming down another wall. You remember that. Almost like she's forming a table. She is the goddess of the sky, and in the evening, she swallows the sun. It journeys through her body, and then she gives birth to it in the morning. You can see the sun traveling across her body. Often, she's shown on the inside of the sarcophagus lid, forming the sky for the deceased. Her name is written with the nu pot and the loaf T and the sky determinative. Geb's name is written like this. The bird in Geb's name looks like our Sa, pin-tailed duck biliteral, but it isn't. It's a slightly different bird, the white-fronted goose. But don't worry, you don't have to learn to draw another bird. The Egyptians used them interchangeably because they were so similar. So we can also. I just want to explain how we get Geb out of what looks like a sawbird. There was a kind of goose in ancient Egypt called the Geb goose, so the goose became used in the name of Geb. Another pair of gods created by Atum are Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture. Shu is sometimes shown holding up the sky, and Tefnut, for some reason, is rarely depicted. Their names are written like this: Shu and Tefnut. I'm not sure why her name is determined by a cobra. Note that these four gods and goddesses are elements: earth, air, moisture, and sky. The Greeks would later have their four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. Now we just need two more pairs and we'll have all the major gods. This is where Isis and Osiris come in. I believe that the myth of Isis and Osiris is the most important myth in ancient Egypt. When I say most important, I don't mean most frequently encountered. There's more to it than that. Myths aren't just stories. A myth is a story. It isn't intended to be taken literally, but you're supposed to learn something very important about the nature of the world from it. Like, is there life after death? Is there a God? Questions that can't be answered by observation. So let's look at the myth of Isis and Osiris closely. We've seen some of it before, but this time we'll look at the names of the gods in the story and also see how truths are supposed to be learned from this myth. Then I think you'll see why I believe it's the most important of all Egyptian myths. Isis and Osiris are the children of Geb and Nut. They are brother and sister and husband and wife. Now you may be wondering why Isis's name doesn't end in a T. It does. Look at the hieroglyphs for her name. The main element of her name is a throne, and you will see that it has a T next to it. It was pronounced East. Later, when the Greeks entered Egypt, they added the IS ending and it became Isis. It was the same for Osiris. His name was written like this. This was pronounced something like Osir, and the Greeks later added their ending to make it Osiris. Isis and Osiris have another brother and sister, Set and Nephthys. Set is sometimes transliterated as Seth, but his name is written like this. He's associated with that strange animal at the end, and we aren't sure what it is. Notice that the tail is forked. People have been trying to identify the animal for a long time, but it may just be a mythological creature. Nephthys is written like this. Her name is a joining of two hieroglyphs, the Neb sign, which means lots of things, like all, every, but also Lord. In this case, it's combined with the hieroglyph for mansion or temple. Notice the loaf T inside the temple? That makes it feminine. So the Neb is not Lord, but Nebet, mistress. Nephthys is mistress of the temple. Again, the YS ending is Greek. Isis, Osiris, and Nephthys are the good guys. But Set, or Seth, either way, is evil, elemental evil. A devil archetype, if you will. He only tries to do harm. Now, according to the myth, Isis and Osiris come down to earth to civilize Egypt. In this context, civilizing means teaching Egypt how to raise crops and domesticate animals. They will no longer be hunter-gatherers. We will now have large established cities. Isis and Osiris do such a good job of civilizing Egypt that Osiris goes away to teach the rest of the world how to do these things. So we're being told that civilization spread from Egypt to the rest of the world. Egypt is where civilization began. While Osiris is away, Set tries to do terrible things to Egypt. But fortunately, Isis is very powerful and keeps her evil brother in check. Isis is the goddess of magic and is called She Who Knows All the Names. That title comes from the ancient Egyptian belief that if you wanted to do a magical spell against someone, you needed to know his name. You would have to say something like, "May a many break his leg." You needed to know his name. Isis knows the names of everyone. You see, when an Egyptian baby was born, he was given two names. One was his real name, which only his mother knew. The second was a name that everyone else knew. So if your real name were really, say, Harry, but everyone knew you as Marvin, then when someone tried to cast a spell on you, they would use the name they knew, Marvin. But since that's not your real name, the spell won't work. This is why Isis is called She Who Knows All the Names. She knows the real names of everyone and can thus control everybody. She's an early superhero. So powerful Isis keeps evil Set in check. Osiris returns from civilizing the rest of the world. Set, though, is always scheming, and he lays a plan. While his brother Osiris is sleeping, Set takes his body measurements and builds a wooden chest to the exact proportions. At a banquet, Set produces the beautiful chest and says, "I'll give a wonderful prize to anyone who fits exactly into this chest." Guest after guest tries, but it never seems to fit. Some guests are too large, some are too small, kind of like Cinderella's glass slipper. Finally, Osiris tries, and it fits him just right, of course. But Set is ready, and he closes the lid, pours molten lead on the chest, sealing Osiris inside. He then throws it into the Nile, and Osiris dies in the chest. It's worth noting that there's no contradiction involved in being a god and being mortal. At this point, Osiris is a god, greater than a man, but still mortal. So Osiris dies in the chest, but the myth doesn't end there. The Nile flows northward to the Mediterranean, and the chest washes ashore at Byblos in modern Lebanon. According to the myth, there is a huge storm, and the chest is blown into the branches of a tree. Now, the tree grows to tremendous proportions, encompassing the chest and its trunk. The king of Byblos is building a palace and needs large trees, cedars of Lebanon, for the pillars. This tree, with the chest inside its trunk, is cut down and incorporated into the palace. So we get the strange situation of Osiris in a chest, in a pillar, in a palace. But that's the way it is. But Isis, the devoted wife, sets out on a journey to recover the body of her husband. She eventually finds out where Osiris is, in the pillar in the palace. She gets a job as a handmaiden to the queen of Byblos and explains the situation. "My husband is in the pillar in the palace." The queen is sympathetic, and the pillar is cut down, the chest removed, and indeed, Osiris is there, dead. Isis brings the body back to Egypt for a proper burial. Set, always scheming, finds the buried body of Osiris and hacks it into 14 pieces and scatters them up and down the Nile. Isis wants her husband to have a proper burial, so she sets out on a journey with her sister Nephthys to recover the parts of her deceased husband. They find all the pieces but one. The phallus is missing. It was thrown into the Nile and devoured by fish. Isis reassembles the 13 pieces and fashions an artificial phallus so Osiris will be whole. She says magical words over Osiris, and he breathes life. Then, taking the form of a bird, Isis flutters over the artificial phallus and becomes pregnant with Horus, their son. Osiris resurrects, and as the first ever to resurrect, he becomes the god of the dead. It's a long and complicated myth, but absolutely central to Egyptian religion. As I said before, myths are stories not to be taken literally, but we are supposed to learn something important. What is it that we're supposed to learn from this one? Almost every funerary belief of the ancient Egyptians is embedded in this myth. First, it answers the question, is there life after death? There is, but it goes much further than that. It tells us what kind of immortality there is. It's resurrection. You and your body are going to get up and go again in the next world. Note, this is not reincarnation, the belief that you're going to come back again as a different person. New Agers always seem to think the Egyptians were reincarnationists. No, they believed in resurrection. This belief in resurrection is the origin of mummification. The body must be preserved for the next world. This is why it was crucial for Isis to retrieve the body of her dead husband. And this is why she had to fashion the artificial phallus, so Osiris would be complete in the afterlife. This practice was followed by the ancient Egyptian embalmers. If the deceased were missing a limb in life, at least he could be complete in the next world. They would fashion an artificial limb for the mummy. Also, we learned that the body must be buried on Egyptian soil in order to resurrect. Isis set out on her journey so she could bring Osiris's body back to Egypt for burial. This, by the way, is part of the reason the Egyptians never colonized. While they defeated and controlled many countries in the Middle East, they never established colonies. No Egyptian wanted to die away from home, away from the embalmers' workshops that could provide them with immortality. The myth of Isis and Osiris teaches us a great deal about immortality, but there's more. Now think about the chest that Set fashions to the exact proportions of Osiris. This is going to become the anthropoid coffin, those coffins shaped like a person that we're so familiar with from Egyptian art. The coffin is different from the sarcophagus. A sarcophagus is stone. It's a rectangular box that holds the body and can also hold the coffins in which the body is placed. The word comes from two Greek words that have found their way into English. The sarc part is flesh, as in our medical term, sarcoma. The phagus part looks like our word esophagus, and it should. It comes from the Greek verb to eat. You see, when the Greeks first came into Egypt and saw dehydrated mummies in those stone rectangular boxes, they called the boxes flesh eaters, sarcophagi. The myth of Isis and Osiris is not talking about sarcophagi, it's talking specifically about coffins. So we also have the belief that there should be a special container for the body, the anthropoid coffin. You can see why I believe that this is the most important myth in all of ancient Egypt. Immortality was central to the ancient Egyptians' worldview, and this myth gives both the broad and detailed picture of what that immortality was. Scenes from the myth were carved on temple walls, and if you know the myth and something about hieroglyphs, then you can have a better appreciation of what's going on. Too often, I see tourists going through a temple in a daze. It's overwhelming because they really don't know what they're looking at. Let's look at a few temple carvings to see what we can make out. I'd like to show you an image carved in a very dark chamber inside the temple of Dendera. Let your eyes get used to the scene. Try to see what's going on. Now let's use our hieroglyphic skills. We can focus first on the central image, the bird. It's time for hieroglyphs. Look at the throne hieroglyph next to the bird. That's Isis's name. That's to let the literate viewer know who the bird is. Let's keep looking. We have Isis in two different forms in the tableau. First, she's shown as a mourner. Now, let's look at Isis when she's fluttering. Who is she fluttering over? The myth tells us that when Isis transformed herself into a bird, she fluttered over Osiris, and sure enough, there he is on a funerary couch. This is the moment when Isis is impregnated and Horus is conceived. We can make out where Osiris's erect phallus was. It's been chiseled off in ancient times, probably by early Christians who took up residence inside this chamber. They also carved off the faces of many gods, and we get the word defacing from that practice. Sometimes the inscriptions on temple walls are like comic book balloons, where the speeches, they let you know what's going on. There were so many gods in ancient Egypt, and they had so many different forms that you almost had to have a program to tell the players. The Egyptians were well aware of this, and they started putting the names of the gods on their heads. Since we're at Dendera Temple, let's use the goddess Hathor as an example. Dendera was dedicated to Hathor, goddess of music, love, and all that good stuff. She's very unusual. Egyptian gods were almost always shown in profile. You will never see Isis or Amun or Osiris looking at you. Hathor, however, was shown frontally, full-faced, as a woman with the ears of a cow. She is a mother goddess who suckled the king when he was born. All the kings showed this scene to establish their divine birth. The columns at Dendera show our full-faced Hathor. However, sometimes Hathor is shown simply as a woman, without the cow ears, in which case she's shown in profile, like all the other goddesses. Well, if she's shown just as a woman, how can we tell her from other goddesses? She looks exactly like Isis. Even the headdress, the horns with the solar disk between them, it's sometimes worn by Isis. How can you tell Isis and Hathor apart? Look for the hieroglyphs. Often, next to Hathor is her name. What we have here is Horus as a falcon in a small shrine. Her name, Hathor, means the abode of Horus. Now, let's look at the entrance to the Temple of Philae. Well, who is it? We know that the temple was dedicated to Isis. So it's a good bet it's Isis. But we can't be sure. The only way we're going to figure this out is by reading the hieroglyphs. So we start searching the text to look for a name. If we could find a throne, it would be Isis. If we find Horus in a square, it's Hathor. Well, there it is. It's Hathor. So even in an Isis temple, you have to read the hieroglyphs to be sure who the goddess is. Here we have Hathor making a guest appearance. Here's another goddess. She looks exactly like Hathor, but she has a throne on her head, so we know she's Isis. The hieroglyphic names of the gods and goddesses are the key to figuring out what's happening on temple walls. That's why it's so important to know them. And the best way to learn them is to write them. So put on your scribe's robe. It's homework time. To reinforce what we've learned today, let me give you a few sentences containing the names of gods and goddesses to translate into hieroglyphs. First, try Hathor and Isis descend to the town in a sacred boat. Next, let's do Nut is in the sky and Nephthys is in her house. Try Isis knows all plans. And our last one, let's do Osiris and Isis are in this boat. Do your homework, learn the names of the gods, and I'll see you next time.